Hello. Part 2 of the nervous system talks about what is a neuron, the properties and the structure of a neuron, and further moving on to the classification of the different types of neurons. So neurons are nothing but small cells which have the ability to be electrically excitable. Further, they can respond to a stimulus and convert that stimulus into an action potential. So what is an action potential? An action potential is nothing but a nerve impulse. It is an electrical signal which propagates or rather travels along the surface of the membrane of a neuron. It begins and travels due to the movement of ions. So basically our body is made up of different ions such as sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium and so on. And the fluctuation or the influx and efflux of these ions across the membrane, the plasma membrane, is the reason that we have an action potential. So this movement of ions between interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between two cells, and the inside of a neuron through specific ion channels in its plasma membrane. Once begun, this nerve impulse will travel rapidly and at a constant strength. Everything that happens in our body is because of the generation and the further propagation of this nerve impulse. Further, they can travel short distances as short as 1 millimeters or as well as very long distances right from below my waist level up to my toe. The tickling sensation, or let's say the movement of your little toes, is everything because the nerve impulses reach till that extent. These nerve impulses can travel great distances at huge speeds ranging from 0.5 to 130 meters per second or 450 kilometers per hour. Astonishing feats. Further, these neurons are structurally diverse. Their cell bodies can range in diameter from 5 micrometers up to 135 micrometers. Further, the pattern of dendritic branching is also extremely varied, and they are distinctive for different types of neurons in different parts of the nervous system. A few small neurons can lack an axon, whereas many others have very short axons. So let's look at a typical structure of a multipolar neuron. Yes, there are a lot of definitions and points to understand here, so we will look at them one by one. The most predominantly feature of a multipolar neuron is a cell body, which contains of a nucleus and other organelles. Second, it has the dendrites. These are nothing but the cell processes, which are tapering, highly branched, and usually short cell processes or extensions. They are the major receiving or input portions of a neuron. Third, and the most important, is the axon, which is also called the axis of a neuron, which is a single thin cylindrical process that can be very, very long, up to 1 meter. It is the output portion of a neuron, which is responsible for conducting nerve impulses from one neuron to another. This is the typical structure of a neuron, where this is the cell body. These are the cellular processes, the dendrites, and the other cell processes, which are called the axons. Now, let's try to understand bit by bit how does impulse get transmitted through a neuron as well as the other components of the neuron. Further, these dendrites can be of different type of structures. They can be cortical pyramidal, they can be extensive in different ways depending on where they are located in the human brain. So if I had to look at the different part of a neuron, let's talk first about the cell body. The cell body is called as the soma or the perikaryon. It contains a nucleus which is surrounded by a cytoplasm. Further, it includes all the typical cellular organelles that we see in a typical cell, such as lysosomes, mitochondria, and a Golgi complex. Further, the neuronal cell bodies also contain free ribosomes. These ribosomes are the sites where the proteins get synthesized. There are also prominent clusters of rough endoplasmic reticulum within the cytoplasm, within this cell body. And this rough endoplasmic reticulum are termed as Nissl bodies. Nissl bodies, which produce newly synthesized proteins. And they also have the ability to replace the cellular components as material for growth of the neurons. and also regenerate the damaged neurons or the damaged axons in the peripheral nervous system. Further, the cell body also has the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton, as you must have studied in your earlier lectures about the types or the parts of a cell, the cytoskeleton includes both neurofibrils as well as microtubules. The neurofibrils are something which composed of bundles of intermediate filaments which provide the cell with shape and support, whereas the microtubules are the ones which are responsible for moving the materials between the cell body and the axon. Next, the cytoskeleton and the nucleus, although they make up the cell body also contains lipofuscin, which is an interesting pigment that occurs as clumps of yellowish brown granules. These granules are located in the cytoplasm and are product of the lysosomes. The lysosomes which are present in neurons release lipofuscin, which is responsible for accumulating within the neuron as the neuron ages, but it does not cause any kind of harm to the neuron. Now let's talk about the nerve fibers. So there are two nerve fibers. One is the axon and the other ones are the dendrites. Let's talk about the axon. The axon is responsible for propagating impulses. It's a long, thin, cylindrical projection which often joins the cell body at a cone-shaped elevation. You can look at this cone-shaped elevation. This cone-shaped elevation is called as the axon hillock, a small hill. The axon contains mitochondria, microtubules, and neurofibrils, as you can see over here. But it does not have a rough endoplasmic reticulum, which, as you all have probably understood by now, it cannot synthesize its own proteins. The third one, or the second nerve fiber, or the second cell process, is the dendrites. Dendrites are like small branches. They are like little trees. They are responsible for receiving all the input portions of a neuron. They are usually very short and tapering, and they are extensively branched. In many neurons, the dendrites can be a tree-shaped array of processes. Again, they will contain cell bodies, they will contain mitochondria and the other organelles. There are other components of the neuron, which let's look at them one by one. The initial segment. The initial segment is that part of the axon which is closest to this axon hillock. The trigger zone. The trigger zone is the place where the nerve impulse will arise at the junction of this axon hillock and the initial segment. This is from where the impulse will transmit or get propagated or travel throughout the axon till its particular destination. Next, within the axon, we have got components like the axoplasm and the axolemma. So the axoplasm is nothing but the cytoplasm of an axon. It is surrounded by a plasma membrane which is called as the axolemma. Lemma meaning sheath or husk. The axon also has axon collaterals. As the name suggests, these are nothing but side branches which move along the length of the axon and can get branched off, typically at right angles to the axon. Further, the axons have a very interesting feature, which is this formation of a synapse. The formation of a synapse is nothing but that area, that portion, that site of communication between any two neurons or between one neuron and an effector cell. The tips of the axon are called as the axon terminals. These axon terminals are having the capacity to get swollen into bulb-shaped structures which are called as synaptic end bulbs. They also exhibit a string of swollen bumps which are also called as varicosities. Further, both the synaptic end bulbs whereas also the varicosities have the ability to get small membrane enclosed sacs which are present within them, which are called as synaptic vesicles. These synaptic vesicles are those areas where the neurotransmitters reside. What are neurotransmitters? Neurotransmitters are nothing but the neurochemicals such as dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, serotonin, which are responsible for all the functions in our body. They are small chemicals which are synthesized, stored, released, reuptaken, as well as metabolized within the neuron. Further, these neurons also have a very good transport system. They have two types of axonal transport: short or slow axonal transport, which is hardly for 1 to 5 mm per day, that is responsible for conveying the information or whatever proteins through the exoplasm in only one direction, that is from the cell body towards the axonal terminals. They are supplying the new exoplasm to the developing or regenerating axons, as well as replenishing the exoplasm in through growing and mature axons. The second type of axonal transport is the fast axonal transport. This is something that occurs for 200 to 400 mm per day, which you can imagine is extremely fast. That is for using proteins that function as motors to move materials in both directions, that is away as well as towards the cell body, and also along the surfaces of the microtubules. So these are the different properties or the functions or the parts of a typical neuron. Everything that I've discussed is present on these slides. You can take a look at them and also come to a reflection point where you can finally understand and recapitulate all the information that has been studied so far. In the next presentation, I will cover the classification of the different types of neurons and then move on to another interesting concept, which is the neuroglia. Thank you so much for listening.